We have the pleasure to have today with us Hernan Diaz Alonso. You know, because some of them you are working with him and with Billy and Peter in the seminar, but today is displaying a fantastic occasion to have him in person and to hear all his experiences and all his ideas. You know that Hernan is the dean of the IAAC, is how to explain, one of our friendships, complice, I don't know, alter egos in the world. Evidently, we like a lot the things that they are doing, and absolutely we are in a intellectual and ideological synergies with IAAC. Also now we are in a new adventures of strategical links with in between the Institute and the IAAC. Also not only for the Institute but also for the cities, but well, we will try to do a lot of things together for this city and for this institute. But also, Hernan is not only an institutional guy, as me. I'm not also an institutional guy. He's also a producer. He's also a producer of architecture and a producer of knowledge. And this is interesting for us also. You are a creator also. Hernan is I read the curriculum to be more precise. We are absolutely happy to be to have you with us. And just a few words to introduce himself. Hernan Diaz Alonso is principal. Is the founder of the office, the practices studio office workshop space Sheriff Arc. In fact, I imagine that a lot of your, I don't know, but you will show some of your projects. And is one of the, I don't know, more important voices of his generation. In a lot of experience here, is not different experiences. He was in Barcelona, also Archie Labs, other manifestations. But before becoming the graduate program chairs at more or less the dean of CI. He has served for the past several years as a distinguished professor of architecture and the graduate thesis coordinator at IAAC. Previously, he has taught as a design studio professor at Columbia University, and he is the head studio professor in the excessive, because he talks a lot of radicality, also in radical regions, me imagino que también viene, in excessive postgraduate program at the University für angewandte Kunst in Wien, Austria. Qué capacidad de hacer ver que... He was recently honored by Yale University with the Kahn Visiting Assistant Professorship of Architectural Design for fall 2010, and by the American Institute of Architects as the Educator of the Year in 2012. Two very important awards. Diaz Alonso has lectured intensively in a lot of institutions. He is also visiting. He has experience very implicated with the transmissions of the knowledge, not only the education, the cultural transmissions of the knowledge, also in numerous events of these situations, as the Venice Architecture of Biennale, the London Architecture Biennale, Archie Lab, etc. There are spaces, some of them more decadent, some of them interesting, the spaces to transmit the ideas and to exchange, to share the ideas. His architecture designs have received numerous awards and have been displayed in both architecture and art museums exhibitions, such as New York MoMA, San Francisco MoMA, Art Institute of Chicago, You can visit also, you can see all this in his web application, but Artist Space in New York, etc. His work has been widely published in magazines and periodical worldwide, and multiple books, including the Excessive monograph and an upcoming monograph by Thames and Hudson. In 2005, Diaz Alonso was the winner of MoMA's Young Architects Program competition. His work has since been the subject of solo shows at the... solo shows se dice, ¿no? Es monográficos, ¿no? Digamos, at the San Francisco MoMA in 2006, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Max Center Wien in 2007. And currently, his office is building the Center of Experience and Media for Boeing in Seattle, USA. It's an important challenge. His work is part of the permanent collections of the Frag Center, the San Francisco MoMA, New York MoMA, Thyssen-Bornemisza Collection in Vienna, Mack Museum in Vienna, and the Art Institute of Chicago. All this to say that he's not, as I think a lot of people who is here, and a lot of people as you in the future, Hernan Diaz Alonso is a representation of a volunteer to do and to celebrate, to transmit ideas, to project and to diffuse. This is an important figure we were talking before, and I think that you are exactly this curious mix between action man and, how to explain, teaching is not the transmitting man. No? Thank you, Diaz, for to be with us. And thank you.
Hey, there you go. Well, thank you for that introduction. Every time that somebody says the word teacher associated with me, I said, how the fuck I get paid for that? Anyway, can we turn off the light so people can take a nap? Yeah, completely dark. There's nothing to see here. It's truly a pleasure to be here. For many reasons. This is an institution that I treasure and support, and I think is the right kind of institution and the right kind of school. And the people involved here are dear friends and people who are partners in crime in the best sense of that notion. Crime, no partners. And also, this is a very dear city to me. I live here in '96. Which I remember now probably as the wildest year of my life. So being here brings some memories. Half of them I don't really remember them that well. But the ones I can remember, they were okay. So I imagine that the ones I cannot remember were great. But also because this is such a city with such a tradition. So to have like an international hub like the IAAC, I think is absolutely critical for the growth of the city. So anyway, what I thought, like in any place that I lecture for the first time, like in this one, I think it's kind of important to give some kind of a background about where the work is coming from and where the work is going. But before we got into a further detail, I want to show you a clip that I think is a good example of the ethos of the work that what we produce in the office. Anyway, I love that clip for many reasons. One, because I really sympathetic with this idea that, just let me put it here so there's more light. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, do I look like a man with a plan? I think that's a great idea for an architect. I think an architect just do stuff. And along the way, you figure it out what it was. But also the interesting thing, there is a kind of a contradiction because, yes, he doesn't have a strategic plan, but he has an overall idea, a sensibility, in this case, destruction of Gotham City and killing Batman, about what he wants to achieve. But there is more about, I like this idea of I wouldn't know what to do if I chase the car. So there is something about that that I strongly believe, not the idea of chaos per se, but the idea of that the work is kind of an afterthought. And as Manuel was saying in the introduction, I'm a peculiar kind of architect. I'm a peculiar kind of animal in that sense. For many reasons, I'll get back to this image, to the text in a second. Because I have a very peculiar practice. I was educated in Argentina, then I studied in Colombia, and I spent the last 12 years of my life in SCIARC mostly, and another institution which are in the same venue than SCIARC. So I have the luxury to have a practice, because in America we call it practice, but if I was in Argentina, I would have a studio, and if I was in Barcelona, we would call it a spatial, which are more okay, but practice in America is kind of tricky, because practice means that we have a lot of projects with clients, which is not the case. Because the way I can operate and the way that academia works in America is a very interesting one, so it allows me to have the freedom to choose in which project to work, what clients to take, what things I want to work on it. So the way that the office operates and my work operates is I always say it's kind of a monster with 3 heads or 3 legs. And it has to do with the academic research that we produce, the work that we produce in the office, which is what I'm going to show you today. What I'm going to show you today is the work that we produce in the office in the last 10 years. But always the work that we produce in the office is highly influential by the work that we do, I do as a teacher, or what I like to think of myself more as a head of a laboratory. And the third component has to do with the flirtation with disciplines that are kind of outside of the limit of architecture, like product design and art and film, that it became like a very critical issue in the work. I just want to point that out because it's particularly when I lecture in Europe and Latin America, I want to make that clarification because if not, it becomes a whole different world game. So when we're talking about the office and the practice, is true, we have that, but also it's a peculiar one. So now, focusing more on what I want to discuss, the title of the lecture is Monstrous Lust. It's just because I like the title, and there is certain monstrosity that always has been implied with the work, and the notion with lust, which interests me big time as a level of emotional reaction. But I would say specifically the work that we produce in the last 10 years in the office, it has been related in a very close relationship with the evolution of the techniques, with a very series of a specific shift that I think happened in the discipline within the last 15 or 20 years, in which I'm very interested in participate and be part of that discussion. Some of these are the one that I put here, which I think it goes along the way in all the works, even the work of 10 years ago, which it was a much more amateurish work than the current work. But I would argue that I've always been obsessed with the notion of cinematic effects as a vehicle for the production of desire. This is a long story, I'm not going to go into details, but I really wanted to be a filmmaker and not an architect. I've ended up being an architect by accident. Well, many people claim I'm not really an architect, and probably in the context of Spain, if we were in the SAB and not in the IAAC, most of the people in the SAB would not consider me an architect. Fuck them. So anyway, then the whole modernism, form follow function, I always found it incredibly stupid and boring. So I'm interested in form following form. I'm interested in the problem of form as the main vehicle for the production of architecture. One day in another talk, I'll explain you why the whole modernism form following function is bullshit. I can prove it. I just not to choose to do it today. So some of you get pissed off, and that's a good thing. The third element, if you're interested in the problem of the problem of form, by default you're into the problem of beauty and the problem of aesthetics. But I'm interested in the grotesque and the horrific alternative mechanism for the production of beauty, and I will go into details as I show you the work. The other one, the last four, which I think are absolutely crucial, one have to do with the problem of image of the vehicle of the production of form. Even though geometry still matters, all the computational tools allows us to operate with a different notion of the production of image. So for me, the final effect of the image of architecture is incredibly important, how you relate to that. And a couple of critical shifts, I would argue another one that is important is the notion of editing versus the notion of composition. So I'm very much interested in that problem versus the traditional notion of composition when it comes to the problem of form. The last two, I will say, and the previous ones are kind of more in general in terms of the discussion of the last 20 years, but the last two, virtuosity and lust and arousal, I will say they're more autobiographical and personal in the sense of I'm interested in virtuosity as a mechanism for thinking architecture, but also pretty much anything that interests me, from art to music to film to food to clothes to cars, they always trade on the problem of virtuosity and tend to don't be interested in stuff or work that we trade on clever. I'm much more interested in virtuosity than in clever. I'm not saying that that's better, I'm just saying that's what interests me. And the last one has to do with the problem of lust and arousal. And this comes from a discussion that has been pretty much in place in the last 20 years. It has to do with the problem of affect. Affect as a rationalization of the emotional reaction of something. So anyway, a couple of things I want to point out before I start to kill you with a bunch of hundreds of images of the work, and to try to establish some of the critical arguments is, for once, I'm convinced that architecture is incapable of producing something new. Architecture cannot produce new. It's a discipline that is not built like that. It doesn't operate like that. Architecture builds in a notion of tradition and melancholy and blah, 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 and it's impossible. But what architecture can do is to be very innovative and reconfigure values. And in that sense, the work of Francis Bacon, for me, has been crucial for many reasons. I like this, of course, the aesthetics aspect I found it interesting, but the one that also I found incredibly interesting is the idea that the technique that he used actually is a very Asian old painting technique, is portrait oil. It's not that radical as innovative like Picasso or Duchamp or many of these guys. He was never interested in that problem. What he was interested in was the idea to convey new affects, a new emotional reaction based on very traditional techniques. But the aesthetics and the formal configuration that come from that were highly innovative. The other one had to do with my hero, Enrique Miralles, which probably all of you know. And it has to do with the ambition of the precision, of the problem of precision, and how you translate and articulate convention or familiarity of an unconventional element. This is how it's called how to lay out a croissant in Europe. In Argentina, it will be called how to lay out a media luna. And it's basically a series of drawings that he did with, I think, Eva Pratt at the time about that level of information. So anyway, those are certain kind of backgrounds and so on. Now, in terms of the talk of the work, I divided in 5 chapters or 5 episodes what I want to talk to you. And I'm going to go really fast over the first 3, and then I want to focus on the last 2. One, I will say the very early work that we were doing around 2000, I would call it experiments. We tend, in the context of discussion like this, and a school like this, and a school like SciArc and others, we tend to confuse and mix all the time experiments with research. And to me, experiments is one thing, research is a different thing. Of course, research have experiments, but experiments are not necessarily constitute the research. Experiments is when you're working and trying certain things without a clear goal. So sometimes something interesting happens, sometimes it doesn't. So the early work, I would say, there were experiments because we were trading in the limits and the possibilities of what the techniques that were available to us. This is very early on in developing of Maya and Alias Studios, animation software that would interest me. So all the projects that we were doing around that time, they were all trading the notion of the singular self is trying to do everything. This seems for you like common knowledge today and so on, but at that time it was a very complicated thing to achieve. So out of all the things, we managed to do a couple of, this was our flirtation, what it's called, it's a whole genre by itself, architecture installation, which are some, this, I always think is the way that young architects get to do stuff, but it's a whole genre that come in museum. But so the only one that we managed to build about that was an installation about it. Now, around that period of time of the work, we were trading again on that problem, but an important project that became an important project, not because I think it's good, actually I think it's one of the worst things that I've ever done, is this competition that we did for the U2, the rock band in Ireland. It was for their headquarters, whatever. But what was interesting about that was it was the first time in the media, and this was a London newspaper, I think The Economist, that they wrote about my project, which I was very happy and thrilled and all those things. And they were talking about a grotesque aesthetic that was coming out of the computers. Until then, it never occurred to me to catalog or to understand what we were doing. And that became an interesting one. The other one is, I like this project sort of because my mother liked it very much because she thinks it looked like a cat. But The problem of the grotesque is something that, of course, is not new and has been trading for a long time, and people like artists like Damien Hirst and fashion designers like Alexander McQueen and many of the British guys in the 90s were trading on that problem. But to me, it became like a really interesting idea to work on it, because the more you investigate about the problem of the grotesque, you realize that we tend to confuse grotesque with disgusting, or we tend to confuse this grotesque with something that is ugly and so on. That's not really the origin of the grotesque in relation to the problem of design, to the problem of aesthetics. One can trace that to somebody like Francisco Goya and the Black period of painting, in which writings all the time they were talking about the problem of grotesque. And basically what happened is they couldn't catalog that work with any of the aesthetic canons of the time. So that, I think, suited really well computational work and design aid by computers, because it was producing a whole different aesthetics that it was not what we were accustomed to understand in relation to architecture. So the problem of grotesque became an interesting one to explore. And when we move into the second phase, which I call the episode 2, a lot of the same, because after we did a whole bunch of projects about the singular surface and so on, we start to experiment with the idea, okay, can we produce at the technical level the technique to produce a whole topologies of transformation of a singular unit and can have a high level of transformation, so the totality, instead to be produced as a singular entity, start to constitute about the accumulation of multiples and transformations. So I was interested to break away with the problem of the single hypercontinuity to start to work with the problem of incremental variation with continuity, for example. But the thing about the grotesque, I want to be very clear, because it's an important problem for us, because I think grotesque is not something that you can choreograph or control. Grotesque is more like an emergent quality. And in that sense, to be clear is, for example, if somebody wants to introduce a friend, boy or girl, whatever is your brand of vodka, and you ask, is she or he hot or beautiful? And your friend tells you, well, she is cute. You know that they mean something else. So it has nothing to do with aesthetic parameters, but it has to do with other things. So grotesque is kind of the opposite of that. So it's an interesting problem, but it's a difficult one to work and try to build an aesthetic agenda in relation to that. But what is associated with that problem is the problem of the horrific and the horror as a mechanism of production, or what I would call the monstrosity. There is a much more interesting problem, because that's something that you can choreograph and you can orchestrate. Like when you think in the movie like Psycho of Alfred Hitchcock, the twee, a scene, you can choreograph a reaction of it. And so there is something about that is interesting. But the notion of monstrosity is also interesting because of familiarity, and then I'll go back to that. Anyway, the first experiment we started to do with this multiple single entity and so on was the PS1 competition for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They invite a bunch of firms to present a proposal, and then they pick a winner, and we won, which is kind of a strange feeling for somebody who have a long tradition of losing competition. But the animation I was showing to you was what we started to show to the jury. So we were not interested to use animation cinematic techniques as a way to represent, but it was a way to convey how the design was thought. And this was the first project that we became aware of the notion of the image and the artificiality of the image as a way to produce architecture. So when we built the pavilion, and we take the first picture and start to send it to some friends, a couple of them they thought there was a photo montage, which I thought, that's cool, that's an interesting idea. So we were obsessed since then, and still I am, that whatever little we managed to build, we want them to look like the render and not the other way around. I'm not interested in the render to look real, I'm interested in reality to look artificial. Anyway, so this is a very funny competition, because since they tell you that you win until it's built, you have only 7 weeks and a fairly tight budget. So we start to develop a whole series of techniques to scripting and so on, how to do the structure. The structure was made out of 1432 pieces, which is kind of super stupid thing. All of them were different, and the script allows you to put it together into assembly. That's the moment that you start to think, well, minimalism is not such a bad idea after all. But then you manage to pull it off, and you build it, and it's quite interesting, and so on, and you learn things along the way, and people react to it. I have to say, for the record, I hate people. I hate the notion of architecture have to be for the people. I don't think that's the case. I think architecture have to be for architecture, and the people choose to relate to it. It's their choice. But people is a disgusting concept in architecture. But in general, anyway, we did it. It was kind of interesting. You learn a couple of things. There was a certain limit. I'm a strong believer, and this is something I learned and steal from Enrique Mirages. I always thought the idea that you cannot work in a singular project. You always have to work in multiple projects. And the projects move from one to other. You start to create families. And I believe a lot in the notion of autopsy. I always believe in the idea that the previous logic of the project nurtures a new kind of logic that you can move on and so on. So after PS1, the problem of the multiplicity of the singular entity and how to organize architecture around that became like a really powerful to us. So I start to explore, okay, what if we start to think in a cellular logic? What if the units are cellular that can grow and transform and change? So if that's the case, why we need to think in terms of type? Why we have to be bound by non-type? Why architecture cannot be operating in the notion of a species? Why architecture cannot operate in those terms? It's important to note that some of this speculation, these are some competitions and projects that we've done along the years. This is for the park in Boston. It's important to notice that some of these thoughts or this kind of a conclusions, they're things that you put together in doing these kind of things, in doing the lectures, in doing the teaching, in doing the discussion. It's not that when you are in the office, you're thinking these things, oh, we're going to work with the problem, the grotesque and the horrific, and the notion of the species of stuff. When you're working in the problem. And you're working in the proximity of the problem, and you're working in the speculation of the technique and the methodology, and there is certain notion about the craft, even the digital one, which I find incredibly interesting. And there is something about doing a project of architecture in the way that you make the bed, or you bake bread. There is something that you just do in doing and so on. So there is something about that I found really interesting. So one of the things that we got invited by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to do a solo exhibition of our work. And as we don't get that many clients and we don't get that many projects to build very often, so every time that we get invited to do a show, we always push. We don't want to do a show architecture. Can we build something? Can we do something and convey the desires of the work that we're trying to produce, and not so much to be pedagogical? So the whole notion about the show was we will not show the process. We will not explain what we do, which, by the way, I don't know if you noticed, that's what I'm doing in this lecture. I never tell you the step-by-step about what we do the process. Why? Because I don't think it's important. I think what is important are the effects and the affects that the project started to produce. We work with similar techniques that a bunch of other young architects use in terms of digital technologies and so on. There is no value in that. I don't believe that the project is good because you use a script, or because you use robot, or because you use milling machine. Who gives a fuck about that? I mean, what it matters is what the intentionality. The tools and the techniques are important, but what matters is the design agenda. So I always say, half a joke, half serious, that Jimi Hendrix sound, like if you think in something like Voodoo Child, you know, the bang, 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 that, you have to do an electric guitar and a wah-wah pedal. You cannot do that with a Spanish guitar. It doesn't work, right? So technology and technique matter big time. Now, try it. I play guitar. I'm not very good at it. And trust me, I'm not Jimi Hendrix. So there is a whole intentionality about what I was using and how you incorporate that. The other thing what interests me about the problem of not revealing process so clear is I think also architecture is a little bit like magic. Not in the Harry Potter way, but in the David Copperfield way. In the sense of there is a lot of technique, there's a lot of effort that goes into that, but what matters is the moment of the show. Is the moment what you do. Then when you talk with other magicians, you trace some of your tricks, but not all of them. But what interests me is how you start to establish that and what computational tools allows you in terms of new possibilities. So when we did the show in SF Moment, the idea was to create a display system that it was made out of this 3-axis mill piece that we painted in car painting like we did in PS1. And in this case, we did it on purpose, that we accelerate the process of the plastics and the painting, so it will have these bubbles, which in PS1 happened by accident. But the New York Times critics thought that we did it on purpose because I like the grotesque. And I told them, of course we did it on purpose. We fuck it up, but you learn that the things are alive and they keep moving and so on and so forth. So anyway, when we did the show, the idea was not to show one particular project or to explain the process, but it was much more about to convey a polemic or a confrontational reaction with the audience and how you start to establish. So then that project got relocated and redesigned for the Art Institute in Chicago. So at that time, we were working a lot with the problem of cellular behavior, and now we're looking into that and looking into blood coagulations and how they move from liquid and so on. Then I realized that it was much more interesting to look at vampire movies and look at how computer graphics were doing vampire blood and real blood, because it was much more interesting. But Then it had to do with my fascination with movies and cinematic effects and what I call autopsies. A lot of the things that we have to do with movies, I'm very interested in movies as a production of effects. I'm interested in blockbuster, big Hollywood movies for inspiration. The worse the movie, I find the more interesting in material to get instruction. I like Fellini and Antonioni and all those things as a human being. I find them completely useless as an architect. I think like movies like Blade or zombie movies or all those things are way more useful and productive for architectural ideas. Why? Because the movies are so stupid that everything is into the image production of it. So you can learn a lot of techniques and methodology, which is incredibly interesting. And particularly, I'm interested in visual effects early on in the 2000s, before they became too perfect, when they were much more filled with intentionality. So as all these things get in play, and I have to say, part of the way that I work, it has to do that I'm like a child. I get bored about everything. So it's not like we keep changing ideas because I think I'm brilliant and that idea is saturated. It's because I get bored, I need to move into something else. Sometimes that's not a good idea. And sometimes it's good to stick with a while for a certain idea and try to figure it out completely. I don't work like that, but it's a good thing for you if you're an architect. One thing I forgot to mention, when we did PS1, for you, those of you who are students here, this is, I'll get back to this in a second. This is a project for a house outside Paris for Nathalie Ceruzzi. But when you go to a presentation, when we did PS1, we won because at some moment the jury asked us about the structure. This structure is going to hold. And I asked Obearu, who were with us, to send me a New York engineer who didn't work with the project, didn't have a clue with the project, but I asked him to be British. You need engineers with British accent. That goes a long way to win competitions. Second are German accent, but it's not as good because it's a little bit more confusing to understand what they say. But the British accent is, I mean, this you think it's a joke, but it's part of the fact. It's part of how you establish an argument about what you work on it. So anyway, moving on in terms of the evolution of the genetic code and species, what we were working for the Ceruzzi, for Nathalie Ceruzzi, is an art collector outside Paris. She have an amazing house, it was done by Claude Perrin, and she have a bunch of sculptures by Andrew Bloch. She wanted to have a guest house for artists and so on. But what we're interested in is, okay, instead to work with one singular cell, what if we start to work with three families of cells at the origin? And we overload the cells with a lot of micro effects and a lot of information early on in the project, early on in the work. And so we start to assign values. So this project that looks incredibly different, all the pieces actually is made out of three components that they tend to repeat in the right place, but you displace it enough that it looks like all of them are different. But the other thing which was interesting about this project is that this one wake up again my love for drawing, my love for 2D and the love for the line drawing and so on. But of course the point of plan and section is not any longer what it was. So plans and section used to be like X-rayed in architecture. It was something that you will understand and organize. Now I think we live in an era much more like an MRI. So when you do a 3D print model, when you work in the computer or whatever it is that you're working on, there is a kind of a much more comprehensive way to understand that. So I'm very interested in the problem of drawings and the problem of three-dimensionality as an image problem and the construction of that. And also I'm very interested to use always the latest technology and whatever is available in terms of software. So when the Mac Center, the Mac Museum in Vienna invited us to do another solo show, I was interested in, okay, what if we go the other road? We developed by then a repertoire, a taxonomy, a way to work, and we have a whole catalog of form that they were incredibly precise, even though they was incredibly complex what we were trying to produce, they were incredibly precise. So when we did for the Pitch Black, again, another bad movie, Vin Diesel movie, awful movie, great effect, cheap movie, they show the monster only in the dark. So we call it a show like that, Pitch Black. We went the other way around. We start to work with real flows and start to figure out what if we start to establish a formless geometry and a formal organization that we can retrofit back into a much more precise one. So the interesting thing about stuff like this when you do this kind of show, this was a series of objects. There were 24 of them. They have the scale of an art object, but even though when you're flirting with art, you realize that despite your best efforts, you're an architect. Because we think in these terms as an architect. We assemble them, we make it, this could be done in one part, but we did it out of three, we put screws, because we want to know how you create moments of empathy between different entities, and so on and so forth. How we're going to distribute in the long gallery, we're going to paint in black so that people are going to move this way, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff that only an architect will consider that will not be a factor in architecture, so in art. So I understand that this is trading and flirting with art, that they have artistic effects and artistic quality, but they have principle of architecture. And this is an important thing, because despite all the things that we work and flirt on the fringe, I think at the end of the day, that's what we do, and that's what we operate, and I think there is a whole tradition of that. So this goes in relation with some of the students in the studio that we were talking yesterday. I'm very interested. I fucking hate when people talk about my work of visionary or utopian or science fiction. That's basically because they're intellectually lazy. It's not my fault, it's their fault, they're idiots. Because I don't work in those terms at all. For me, this work is real, it's for now, and it's alternative mechanism to understand reality. That's why I'm interested in the problem of hyperrealism, and I'm interested in the problem of fringe. I want a fringe architecture, not a visionary architecture. I'm interested in the idea that this is a reality. The problem is they don't get it. So that's the other part I like about the Joker at the end when he says, see, I'm not a monster, I'm just ahead of the curve. So it's not that I'm saying I'm a genius or anything like that. I'm just saying I have a very hardcore modernist technical education in Argentina before I went to Colombia. So I think like an architect. And believe me, each of these projects that I'm showing you, this is a concert hall for a competition in Sweden, then of course we lost the plan. I swear, if you look at it, the plans work. Everything functions. I mean, not because it interests me, a program doesn't interest me at all. That doesn't mean that we don't do it. I'm just saying I don't understand it as a vehicle for the production of architecture. I find it irrelevant because it changed, because it doesn't matter. What matters, what makes architecture amazing, is the romantic aspect, the capacity that it has to change how we behave. Now, I take plans and function very seriously because I was 6 years in Argentina with professors that would not let me do anything if the bathroom doesn't work. So I know how to do that, and trust me, it's fucking easy. So don't let anybody to tell you that. That's the stupid thing, that's the cheapest thing to buy also as a consultant. It's the easy thing to do is to make a project to work. What is much more difficult to do is to do an architecture that tries to have a cultural aspiration. Architecture is a cultural practice. It's not a craft. This is one of the things that 50 years of bad understanding of modernism give us as a heritage of education. This idea that architecture is a craft. Bullshit. Architecture is a cultural practice. Architecture shapes culture, shapes society. Architecture should show how the work should be, not how the work is. Whoever tells you otherwise is a fucking moron loser. The only thing that they want to do is make money and serve a capitalist service who hijack the high purpose of architecture. That being said, I fucking love money, so there's nothing wrong with that. Don't be a torture artist and so on. You have to find your own terms of success. I'm just saying that success without glory is useless. It's useless. And it's the worst thing. There's nothing worse than being hopeful. When people say, there is hope for you, tell them, fuck you. That's the worst thing, is that you have hope. And it's important, that it's really, really important in a place like the IAAC, do not get hijacked in this idea of visionary thing. It's just a way to diminish you. It's a way to say, oh, that's for later. This is for something else. It's bullshit. Society is accepting that in any other field, and it's our job to fight how we do that in architecture. And my way, I'm not saying that what I'm doing is the truth. I just say it's one of the ways to work, and I believe in that. And I'm absolutely serious. And when we get a commission to do a chair, and we have to speculate about the IMS problems, and this chair is built, and so on, we take it seriously. We don't fuck around. We figure it out. We work it. And this is something that, you know, when the people said your project was on budget, the projects of architecture that get built, they're always on budget, whatever was the last budget. So whatever is the budget that you have to come on budget. There's no other way around. So when they say they went over budget, not true. The last budget, you give me more money than the previous one, so it was on budget. The thing is, you have to figure it out how to work on the problem. Now, and you have to be careful with that, because we did it in one afternoon. It was a guy, Natalie Ceruzzi, remember we were doing a house up there, too much money. She said, okay, let's do a pavilion, too much money. She said, okay, can you do the furniture? All for the same money. And I say, yeah, I think we can do a furniture. She says, I like the IMS chair. Okay, we can develop a whole series of virus and contamination and mutation of the IMS chairs. We did. We did it one afternoon. She didn't like it, but the Art Institute liked it, commissioned it to us, and I hate it. So the problem is you have to take seriously any project that you work and any scale that you work, because you never know which one they get built. So be careful with that. Take all of them seriously. So this one is built. It's in the collection. I see it once in a while, and it's a worth thing that we've done. Actually, the U2 Tower is worse, but this one is pretty bad too. Anyway, but the funny thing about that is that it allows us to start to play with the scale of product design, which I'll go back in a second. So the fourth episode is what I call misfit. Part of the problem with computational work is that it creates a hypercoherency. It creates hypercoherency of aesthetics. It's very difficult to break away. So I would argue that we are in a very interesting moment because young architects and young students like yourself and not so young architects like me, even though for architecture I'm still very young at 43, it's the only discipline I'm 45 you're young. And anything else you're not young, you're middle-aged. But for architecture we are young. It's just young architect means you haven't built much. But anyway, when you speculate about this problem, the misfit is an interesting one because to me it was a mechanism how we can start to break away, how we start to reclaim a certain level of authenticity, a certain level of humanism, a certain level of individualism within the work. And the work, and for me that would start to flirt with this notion of misfit. What if instead to work, as you can see the previous project that we were doing, they have a lot of extreme formalism and so on, but they were all trading in a certain effect of sameness. They were all coming out of the same entities. The Hammer Museum in Los Angeles did a big show on John London. He's an interesting architect whose architecture appears a lot in movies. And they invite 4 architects, Wayne Cadabendum, Neil Denari, myself, and somebody else. I don't remember who was the 4th. And each of us, we got one of the houses of John London, and we need to add a 30% to it. And what was interesting about this, it was we needed to negotiate with an existing geometry of the house. In this case, was an octagon, and this one we were joking as an excuse. This was a house that appears for the bad guy in Diamonds Are Forever, James Bond, and we thought, okay, in the 60s, this was seen as an evil thing, an evil aesthetic, because the evil guy of James Bond will use the house, but today it's not evil enough, so we added 30% of evilness to it. But that was kind of anecdotal. What was important for me was the idea how you can create a friction between completely antagonist formal vocabularies. If that was a possibility to start to work with the problem of hypercoherency, which is something that interests me a lot. So the notion of mutation and the notion of mutants, or the notion of mutilation, I start to become more and more fascinated with these kind of gore qualities. This is the first silverware collection that we developed for Alessi. And part of the work that we were producing is start to attract attention for product design companies and art and so on, and interests me. I mean, every scale of design interests me, but all of them became for me platform to speculate about the problem of architecture, the problem of assembly of part, the problem of relation between units. This was an art piece that we did for Selfridges in London. In parallel, all these projects, we work in 2 projects at the same time. So we were working with these genetic codes that can move from one scale to another. So the Alessi silverware, the art piece, and this competition for a media museum in San Sebastian, they were all coming from the same root of genetic codes. We were using the same series of primitive formal behaviors to start to organize them. And there is something about computers that fascinates me, which I will say the scalelessness of that. I'm not saying that the problems per se don't have any scale, but there is something about the possibilities that you can go back and forth between a scale that is super fascinating to me. There is much more a problem of relation between parts than a problem of a scale of size. So there is a fundamental difference between a scale and size. I mean, we tend to confuse a scale and size that they're part of the same thing. They're not. And that fascinates me. So as you can see, I mean, the postgraduate in Vienna, the book, and so on that we decided we call it excessive because I have zero capacity to edit work out. If you see every project that I show you get more fucked up and more complex than the previous one. And okay, we figured it out how to do perforations. Okay, let's do that. We add and we add, we add, we add, we add. So, but what was interesting about this one and the notion of the misfit was that this project was an addition to an existing building, a 19th century building. So I was really fascinated by the notion of mutation and decay between the relation between the tissues of the existing building and the city, and the possibility to create a new entity and new qualities, and new, almost like an alien quality. So one could argue that the work was trading always in certain notions of science fiction, but science fiction doesn't interest me. What I'm interested in, as I said, is much more the notion of fringe. And I would argue that until this project and some others, I still were interested in primarily in the formal problem. But this one, I think the plans and the reconfiguration of that, the transformation of that, it becomes more obvious. And I'm very fond of this project because I think this one will crack the possibilities of this relation between multiple ontologies. So I've always been obsessed how you can create variation without producing collage. And this project was a good blueprint for us to start to think about what I call the problem of multiple ontologies, the idea that you can work with different qualities that can produce a new totality in which you're allowed to read the parts without thinking that it's a collage. And that to me was a fairly small accomplishment, but it's something I feel very proud about, the same way with the grotesque and the horrific as alternative way to a production of beauty. So I want to be clear, I'm not interested in producing ugly or horrific buildings. I'm interested in producing beautiful buildings. But I think the path to contemporary sense of beauty have nothing to do with the traditional canons of beauty. It had to do with things that had to do much more horrific and grotesque qualities that introduced the different possibilities of that. And this was another competition for a museum in Poland. And now we're becoming close to what I want to talk about, which is agents of contamination, of agents of mutation with the coherency of the project, right? So I became more and more obsessed with the problem of ritual. I realized, even though I'm an atheist as an individual, I realized as an architect, I'm highly Catholic and highly religious. I have a very religious sense of what architecture is. And there is something about architecture that is highly ritualistic and is fascinating, and the techniques and all that, they have to do with that. And of course, you can think that an artistic expression, like somebody like Matthew Barney trade on that, but also something that has to do with the Spanish culture, and that just fascinates me, and I go back to that, which is the high and the low, or what I call the raw and the sophistication. The brutality of killing a bull with the sophistication of the ornament and the colors and the elements of the bullfighting and the rituals of it. I know that there's no more bullfighting in Barcelona, which is one of the few reasons to don't come anymore to Barcelona. But I was highly sympathetic to bullfighting. But anyway, there's something about that interests me a lot, the contradiction of that. The other element, going back again to the cinematic, have to do with the construction of instrumentality and the condition of the effects of it. These are the tools. I don't know how many of you saw the movie of David Cronenberg called Death Ringers. It's a movie that Jeremy Irons plays twins that are gynecologist genius. It's a very disturbing movie. But basically, they create their own tools to extract babies. Then you realize when you see the whole movie that these things have nothing to do with the narrative of the movie. It's not important in the story. The only thing that is important is to showing early on in the movie there's something deeply wrong with these two guys. So they use formal behavior to determine social behavior. It's not important to the cinematic construction, it's important to the psychological construction. That interests me a lot as a problem when it comes to the problem of form. It's not only the appearance of the form, it's not the iconicity of the form, is the psychological effect that formalism and strength formalism can produce in the relation how you use the space. The other thing which is really interesting, it has to do with the artificiality of the construction of it. These pieces, I know the guy who bought it is a collector in Chicago. They're made out of paper mache. They're made out of paper, painted in silver. They're fragile as hell, and they pretend to be heavy as hell. Anyway, that notion of social behavior, social behavior interests me big time when we start to work for Alessi again. Alessi in 2 different years, the one on the left is 2010, the one on the right is 2011, commissioned us a bunch of ideas of different collections. So they didn't want us to work on a singular problem, they want to develop a whole collection of objects. So the David Cronenberg movie became really interesting to me because it was this idea. So we start to work in this series of objects. Alessi has different levels. This is what we will call Alessi Officina, which is basically very expensive objects that they had to pretend that they work, but nobody will use them for real. But we wanted to make them work. So the one in the left right now is a corkscrew, it's a bottle opener. The one in the, so there are different moments of ideas exploration, but I like to show it together because I'm interested for you to see the evolution from one year to the other world. The one in the left was still traded in this kind of hyper ornament, borderline rococo, excessive. And the second one is when we start to introduce the notion of ritual, of mutation and transformation, that doesn't belong to the coherent that put the work they put the pieces together. So the other thing which was very interesting about this, and I'll show you more. Let me see if I can. No, well, anyway, doesn't matter. They go too long. In the 2010 collection, what was interesting, these objects were, we call it objects of mutant manner. And what I was obsessed with the silverware, particularly because it gives you the feeling that you use and you will get hurt. Which is not the case, but I like that idea that you will be apprehensive. But the other thing which was interesting, it was pointed to me by Todd Gannon, one of our critics in IAAC, is that if you will use this, your arms will go like this. So it will completely change the behavior that you relate in the table. So he was saying, that's a perfect argument for you how an extreme formalism can change a functional behavior. That doesn't mean that will make it better, but certainly will make it more interesting. So we tried to convince Alessi that instead of doing metal, we wanted to do in plastic, that there will be chrome, like we did the thing. So we wanted to do like a super high-end plastic silverware. At the end, they wanted to do in plastic. We tried to do metal, and it was too complex in terms of the molding, so it only went to prototypes. We also developed a whole series of glass collection based on that. And what is funny is this is the architect part, is like, you really don't need to do drawings for any of these things. I mean, the product design company don't care about the drawings, don't even care about the renders much. They just want them to send a 3D print that they figure out from there. But I like to do drawings because we are architects, so we do drawings and then we do a lot of useless things. It should come with a job description of being an architect, that half of the things that you do are useless, and you're doing just for self-pleasure, which is kind of pretty much what my father always thought that was architecture was, or at least my kind of architecture. Anyway, we did a tray, ashtrays, cigar cutters. So in the second version, the collection that is going into production, we find a way to simplify the morphology, but amp the complexity of the behavior of the articulation of the piece. So this is a candle holder in which we start to use ZBrush to produce three-dimensional effect on the surface. So surface for me were boring, but this one was interesting because it allows us to produce all these series of articulations. So the ornament will become instrumental and functional because that's why you will stick the candle, and then also the geometry of the articulation will be the one that will direct how the wax will melt, and eventually the wax will make it into the tablecloth, which I like a lot. So then we did a bottle opener, a paperweight, another paperweight, blah, 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 whatever. Also for Alessi, we did a series of display system for an exhibition that they wanted to do to show their new collection. But around this piece is when the whole notion of rituals and certain notion of literality start to apply. Because then the deformation of the formal behavior was not belonging anymore to one singular entity. They start to produce misfit. The idea that you can have opposite formal languages and so on, you can start to see that the work is not that coherent anymore, then it start to become much more aggressive and so on. In parallel to that, we were invited by the MAC in Los Angeles to do a simple installation that was supposed to be 6 weeks. It was a very tight budget. So I was thinking, okay, how we can start to incorporate more dirtiness into this. So we developed an incredibly complex geometrical structure that we decided to build it out of flowers. So we went to the flower market, we hired 6 Mexican women, extraordinary, who does the flower arrangement for funerals. And I said, can you build this structure for us? And they say, yes. So we incorporated this, we did the thing with projectors and show animations of the work. The exhibition was there for 6 months, so at the 6 weeks, at the third week you couldn't walk in by the smell. And then the thing started to collapse and so on. I was really interested in the area, can we take the decay and the mutation that we were using conceptually and be literal? I'm very interested in the problem of literality when you work with those kind of factors. I'm not interested in the organic per se, but I'm interested in the literality of it and how you can produce that level of contamination and distortion and so on. So working with the installation of flowers start to trigger a couple of interesting ideas, which is the work that we produce is so articulated and so full of density and so on, why not to use it to grow plants or to grow flowers and ivies and stuff like that? And that it was interesting for 2 reasons. One, it would allow us the capacity, it will have the capacity, that the project can change over seasons. So in the summer it will be much more colorful, in winter it will be darker, and also it's all one of the fundamental problems that we always have, which I never knew how to work with color. I'm very bad, and I think most of the architects are bad with color. But I like the idea that plants and flowers will play that role. Francesca von Habsburg, which is a member of the Thyssen family from the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, have a very nice small museum in Vienna with an extraordinary contemporary collection. She decided not to give it to the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, and she hired 3 architects to do 3 small pavilion museums in different parts of the world. Francois Roche was one, I was the other one, and I think the third one never got hired. And ours was supposed to be in Patagonia. The tricky part about this is a fairly small project. It's only roughly 5,000 square, this version was 7,500 square meters, which for a museum pavilion is fairly small. The effect was tried to produce that the building looked much bigger, and also that the building will be done in different years. So there was a sense of monstrosity, of Frankenstein, that will never be complete. So the desire was to produce a project that almost like a mutant, or a mutilated object, or mutilated body, that it will never have like a final end. So you can do 2 or 3 of these volumes, and it will be okay. You will never know the difference when it's finished or when it's not finished. Or you can build just a structure with the flowers, and it will be enough. So we working to figure it out, the different pavilions and components, and this was in the Venice Biennale in 2010. And we fabricated big models in which we incorporate the flowers as a way to set it up, as a way to convey that. We are in a different version that it maybe get built or maybe not. And this brings us to the last episode, which is the one I want to talk about, the last 3 or 4 projects, which is, I call it the rituals I was incorporating plus RAF, which I mentioned a little bit, plus Pampas. As I was saying, I'm from Argentina. I'm from Argentina. And this guy, which Willie also loved, Francis Malman. I don't know, it's because I became a father or whatever the hell happened, but at a certain moment in your life, you start going back to certain of your roots. And mine was going back to certain primitivism and the ritual of certain Argentinian qualities of cooking and gauchos. Francis Malman is probably the most prominent chef in Argentina, extraordinary avant-garde chef. And long story short, 5 or 6 years ago, he went a little bit cuckoo through a bad divorce or whatever. He sold his restaurants, and he started going all over Argentina in the worst climates and the worst part to cook in the most primitive way, combined with very high-end way of cooking. So I find that a fascinating notion of problem of primitive with high-end. So the idea to take the whole notion of primitive quality with incorporated with very contemporary sophisticated technique. Going deeper into that, there was a whole other notion of rituals that came from Argentina, from the gauchos, and the ornament that the gaucho used to hunt and to ride horses, that incredibly feminine and incredibly saturated with ornaments and so on. So these are very, very brutal, primitive acts done with these incredibly sophisticated objects. So I thought that that was a fascinating logic to start to work with the problem of mutation and mutant quality. So the first thing that we did based under this logic or this internal rule and create, and a certain flair with Romanticism. What interests me about Romanticism in the 19th century is, now we confuse sometimes Romantic with Romanticism. Romanticism was an intellectual movement and tried to oppose the Enlightenment or the rational movement of Germany, which is always a good idea to oppose anything that comes from Germany in general principles. But this one was interesting because it was trying to use the notion of imagination as a way to understand totality versus rationality. What interests me about the contemporary culture, the contemporary aesthetics, is I don't think we need to choose anymore. I don't think it's either systematic, rational, or Romanticism, expressionist, individual. You can combine both. And computational tool, and for me the work has been the obsession to try to figure out how the systematicity and so on have the capability to produce also highly inspiring individual precise work. And how the notion of monstrosity and how the notion of that allows us to produce that level of quality. That's always something that interests me about Frankenstein. Frankenstein is not completely different than a human. It's slightly different, and it's the stitching and assembly that part what makes it disturbing. It's not the typology, it's the quality how the thing was set up. So when Vitra asked us to do a chair, we proposed this, we call it the rose chair, in which the structure and the scheme will completely detach as formal behaviors, but they have enough moment of empathy that allow them to integrate them. And also then we were proposing that they will be covered with flowers as a way to produce a cushion. Anyway, Nathalie Sedusi, the French client, came back to us and said, hey, can we keep working with the furniture thing? So we proposed for her to do this bench for the garden, and this is what we came with, and so we multiplied on these things and so on, with the raw and the rituals and so on and so forth. Also, we are doing, this one we are fabricating right now, we're fabricating this for a friend of us for his estancia in Argentina, and we're gonna do that with cow skins. I wanted always to do it, something with cow skins, and Corbusier and a BKF chair homage. So anyway, and this is how it's going to look in Natalie's house. It will be complete, I think, like in 2 months or something like that. In parallel to that, we were commissioned by a company in Limoges to do a chandelier, a porcelain chandelier, using very historical tradition techniques of porcelain. So we were, we were flirting around with certain literality of a certain monstrosity. So we came with this idea to do this kind of a small lamp for kids, and then to do a bigger one, the chandelier by assembly. So the notion of mutilation and butchery, and I like butchery because it's very brutal, but it's incredibly precise. It's a lot of very specific techniques. So we were interested to do this and the cut and revealing and ripping off. So a lot of techniques that come from primitive qualities like butchery and so on, try to apply in a simulated environment. So there's something about movies I look a lot always how they do killing and how they do mutilation of bodies and so on. So I have a fascination for all this casting stuff, and then find a way how that became a vehicle to produce beautiful stuff. In that sense, way before the Alexander McQueen killed himself, I always find him a very interesting creature, because here was the most influential fashion designer in the last 20 years, who have also this fascination with all these weird things, but at the same time produce the most beautiful dresses, the more precise, and he have a complete control of fashion with all the innovation, also trading in that problem. Anyway, this is the chandelier. We are manufacturing 4 of them, 1 of them for the Victoria Albert Museum in London. In parallel to that, the Wexner Center in Ohio, through Jeff Kipnis, commissioned us our first art commission. This is an art commission, not an architecture one. It's a sculpture one, so I wanted to do it out of meat. I want to mill and cut and mutilate and reconfigure pieces of meat with the robots. So we're going to produce this with robots, so we're going to do robot butchery, which I think is the most interesting way to use robots, to make them butchers. And then we're going to plastify this with a process, and we will allow the meat to rotten inside, but it will cover the smell. We bump into certain problems with exhibition because apparently we don't follow the regulation of animal protection, which is kind of a strange thing, because explain that I don't want to kill the cows. We're going to use cows already dead. And so we're going to buy just pieces of meat. But anyway, what interests me about that, the piece of meat by itself is not important. What was interesting to me that in parallel to this, the Ritz-Carlton in Miami commissioned us a sculpture piece too. So I was interested to do exactly the same sculpture, one in meat and decadent and decay, and the other one in super high-end plastic composite, the most expensive one. So I was interested to see, okay, how much of the emotional reaction had to do with the tactile, the provocation of the materiality and the sensibility of the body behavior, and how much it had to do with the formal behavior. So for me, it was a little bit of an experiment to play around with the notion of art. But also the notion of meat, it was because I really needed to work with an element that had nothing to do with architecture. So I wanted to work in the art domain with a completely literal thing which you will never be able to do in architecture. Like if we are interested in cutting cows, you cannot make an architecture out of that, but you can do a piece of art about that. So I was interested in the limits of that, and we did another version for the Ritz-Carlton in Bahamas. We're going to build this one soon, and the show in Ohio opens next year from now. If we can figure it out, we figure it out. We can do the robots outside in Kentucky in the winter, so you don't need to froze the meat, whatever. Anyway, it comes with a lot of interesting problems. But there is something about the butchery and carving which is really interesting, which is different than cutting in the way that you cut. Butchery follow the form, follow the bones, and you carve based on the formal behavior. So I'm interested also in the geometrical problem of that. It does have possibility for sections and plan in a different way. Anyway, out of these things from Miami, we did another product for Alessi, which is our espresso and coffee cups. That's basically an accumulation of these things, and it has also a very particular way to grab them and come with a spoon and whatever. It's just product. A quick thing I want to show you is not the most radical project that we've done, but it's a project that's going to be built in the next 6 months. I just want to point this because when we show all the stuff that we do, some of the students start to get excited because the work is strange, but some of them get worried and disappointed because it seems a lot of nonsense and whatever. But Boeing, one of the main manufacturers of airplanes in the world, together with Airbus, they hire us to produce the interior project, the most expensive interior that they're doing, which is to launch the 787 customer experience cert. And we're working with Alex McDowell, one of the most prominent production designers in Hollywood. They're producing all the content, all the narrative, and we are producing the architecture. So a big chunk of the project is an existing warehouse. So our job is to produce a whole series of architecture events that will place hold all the scenographic things or display of information that Boeing will do. So basically the project is a ceiling and a couple of walls, but it will be super loaded with a huge amount of screens. So we are designing also the logic of how the information move from one skin to another, how there's articulations in the walls and the ceiling and go from one territory to another. This one is not so much trading in the notion of rituals of the most recent work. This is trading with certain older ideas. But there is a quality about the multiplicity of elements working all together that interests me, and the construction process and how you're going to do it and how we're going to do each of these displays and these robots that will all move when people walk in and follow. There's a whole level of very complex series of information that move from one to the other, in which the architecture is not per se the main thing, but architecture set the stage for what is going on the screen, and also we will be involved in the construction of the animations and all the elements in the screens and so on and so forth. So there is all this kind of cinematic aspect. So it has been an interesting challenge for us, because part of the formal behavior is an abstract one. But in parallel, when we're working with Boeing, the last two projects I want to show you, there are two bigger projects. One was a competition for a library in Helsinki, which I assume many people in Barcelona did. This was a very interesting project for us because the nature of how the site was working it was impossible to escape a certain problem of box. So we had to deal with that box, and to me that was an interesting problem. The second one was that this was the first project in which the notion of social behavior or social behavior modification to extreme formalism, we tried to figure it out that we can build a strategy about that. So our argument for the library was that the library don't matter anymore as libraries, but that libraries are just public presence of distribution of knowledge. It's not any longer about the accumulation of books. It's a political, social, cultural message that a city want to send to the world and to themselves, that they care about that. So what we argue that in the boxy part, we will have public parks with different activities. This is Helsinki, so half of the year the weather is awful. And the library will happen in the anomalies. Most of the architects will go the other way around. They will put the most functional part in the normative, and they will put the more prosaic part in the anomalies. So because we have a bunch of anomalies, the anomalies became the rule, and the rule and the normative became the anomaly. So there was this idea to me, it was an interesting one, and I was very surprised and pleased because before the jury, they did a public exhibition so that people can vote. And out of the 350 entries, we were in the top 5, which is unusual because people never really like what we do. But that means that we're doing something wrong, which is getting old or whatever. But anyway, it was a grateful surprise. The jury didn't pick us, but they were not obligated. But it means that the idea of a ludic and playful attitude towards the problem was the right attitude. But what, for me, conceptually, for the evolution of the world, what was interesting about this was to go to the extreme notion of rituals of mutilation, to take the box and to use all the series of instruments to mutilate them and produce a whole series of transformations in it. And to don't be afraid of that, which is something that in the past we resist. So I was very pleased for the way, for example, the way that the plans integrate certain normatives and so on, and work with the perversion. Perversion is always very interesting to me, the notion to pervert every logic. So I'm very interested in form as a formal problem, but not as a cultural problem. I'm interested in form, well, I have a cultural sensibility, but I'm interested in form as an agent for provocation, as an agent for rethink the notion, as a nation to challenge what people can do. We tend to think, never trust an architect who says, we do what the people want. Bullshit. They're doing what developers want, which is a different thing. People don't know what they want. It's our job to tell them what they want. Architects should do what the people want if the people knew what they want. In that sense, you guys should read Steve Jobs' bio, because he's the guy, the most successful entrepreneur in the last 40 years, and he never cared about focus groups. He never cared what people think. He create a need for it. I'm not saying that what we do is completely precise, but there is that idea that architecture has to have that notion to challenge how you interact. So the last project I want to show you, which is the one in the poster, is a current version of the Thyssen-Bornemisza pavilion. They became smaller, but this is the one that probably goes farther in this notion of the ritual and the notion of misfit to build the coherency. So this one is the first project in which I would say we go a little bit Dalí or surreal, in which we use the backdrop of the existing condition, not as a frame that want to be canceled like the rest of the project, but something that we want to be mutilated or destroyed or attack. So we use the nature of the Patagonia and the quality of that as a way to trigger a whole different level of dirtiness of the mutation of the process. So this one is probably the one that comes more close to this notion of monstrous glass. Yeah, the work have that kind of a monstrosity, but also there is a kind of a trending of a certain kind of a interesting level of sensual quality of formalism that it tried to go almost in conflictive interest with formalism. Sorry. So that I find, I find this not necessarily the most successful project in that terms, but I think it became kind of at the beginning of a whole series of families and a whole series of autopsies that this project will produce and evolve for us. So I'm very interested to have this kind of a certain Platonic geometry to be very obvious and how that things integrate with that kind of recognizable quality. So I'm interested in how the horrific became more familiar, because I think when it becomes more familiar, it's more disturbing. There's something about that notion of the Frankenstein quality, and of course in barbecues and all the things, Argentinian way. But anyway, that's where we're working with the project right now. This is the state of the project. And of course, it's kind of a very open and straightforward, literal mutilations of flesh and blah, 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 but whatever. But also flowers and happy and blah, 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 and live animals and dead animals. I want to conclude with a clip that I like a lot, because it's a clip that I think talks a lot about the way I always feel about myself, about young architects and young students.
This was a support. I'm really okay. Trust me. Everything's gonna be fine.
So, trust me, trust yourself, everything's gonna be fine.
You met me at a very strange time in my life.
And make sure that everybody who meet you, clients or whoever, always met you in a very strange time of your life. Thank you. Do you guys do Q&A? Can I smoke for the Q&A? Fuck. Civilization, the search for civilization continues. You can turn on the lights for the Q&As. If you want.
They need some time to adapt.
All right.
To mutate. Do you have any questions for Hernan? Okay, I'm gonna warm up a bit the group. Thank you, Hernan, first of all. It has been like, I know your work, and I would have to say that it's very, very much different hearing you explaining it and just checking what you have been doing and reading some text. So thank you for that. I was thinking during the several projects that you have been showing that there is an amazing, amazing amount of design qualities of all the forms that you are generating, and not only design qualities but also like technical skills, which makes me wonder at the moment, especially when you get to the scale of the buildings or the pavilions, it makes me wonder how come there is not even a project that you are interested in provoking, not by making the artificial as the most prominent, let's say, as the most prominent way of dialogue with the context, but rather as a continuation of the qualities of the context itself. So, I don't know if I make myself clear.
I'm not so sure if I understand what you're asking.
So it always it always seems that the projects that I know that you're saying that you're very much interested in these monstrous qualities, and you are very much interested in the artificiality of the forms that you are producing. You know? And I am wondering whether there has been any project in your practice or in your academic, let's say, work that it's treating formal elements not as parasites that they land in the context, but as this kind of continuation that the context itself creates. No.
Yeah, I mean, no, I understand. I will say some projects are more like that and so on. I usually tend not to talk in those terms. Not because, I mean, I think to me it's a little bit what I was talking about program. To me, that kind of works on the ABC of the problem of architecture. Just trying to put the lazy animations because they're too long. I didn't want to show in the lecture, but they can be run in the back. But to me, the context is a factor, and some of them more than others. So I think the museum in San Sebastian, we took big consideration. Other ones, there's a kind of a trajectory with their own entity.
No, but I don't mean the program, I mean the context.
No, I understand. Some of the context, I think in some projects more than in others, we take into consideration. It's never so much a factor for me for the argument. That doesn't mean that we don't do it. I think there are projects that I would say some of the most recent projects, they are. I would argue that the last one with the Patagonia, the context matters big time for it. But at the same time, I think also that the work has to have their own character, their own entity, and I think you work with the at least I'm interested to work with the context in a more frictional base, more than in a friendly phase. And I could be completely wrong, but to me, one of the things that always fascinates me about the work of Enrique, and I know Enrique was very interested in the context and the day-by-day life and so on, and I believe him that he was truthful to that. But I always thought that his work was the other way around than most of the critics understood. I always think that they always argue that the work was about context and lines and nature, which it was to an extent, but I always think it was the other way around, that his project was highly artificial, and he was stretched until it make it feel like he belonged to that context. And to me, that's a more interesting way to work with the problem. But, I mean, you may be right. I will be the first one to admit that any project with capital P, I'm not talking about an individual project, I'm talking about, I'm talking about the capital P, the project at large, my project as an architect. You always have certain limitations. You always leave certain parts. I mean, it's kind of a choreography. You choose certain ones to be the main dancers, and some of them are the chorus line. So I will not deny that that's a weakness of the work. I will also admit that there is a kind of problem with materiality that is a weakness of the work. Not that the things that we do don't have material, but I don't. It's something that is not in the forefront of my thinking when we are working. I need a certain level of isolation, of abstraction of the work to it. But I always interested to be in architecture problems, and they always put in a context, and they always work in the context. Now, do we do a lot of investigation about the context when we work on it? No, we don't. It comes from more the internal logic, but it always lands in the context, and there always a friction with the context, and there is always subtle moves with lines that we pick here and there. Then also there are tricks of the repertoire that are still from people like Enrique or Alvaro Sisa, and are still very much there. I think part of that is also, I would argue, there is a problem of sensibility when I would talk with a contemporary way of design, which is the three-dimension. Three-dimensionality is always much more difficult to make the case about how you work with the context. I think the plans, if you look at the plans of some of your projects, I think they work quite okay with the context.
I also think so.
It becomes much more brutal in the 3D, and I'm happy with that. I like the idea that as the most traditional sense of the discipline, yeah, we take care of it, but when the guys stand up, yeah, but then I think it's a fair criticism. I'm not saying, there's nothing I hate the most than Q&As when the architect get defensive. I will say, yeah, you're right to a point that, yeah, it's not a major thing, but it's there. I mean, it is there. And I'm evolving in that sense. I'm more interested in that now. Even though we live in a global, I'm interested in the notion of rituals. And so for me, the context is not just a geometrical problem about the context. For me, for example, the library for Helsinki is incredibly context-based. Nothing to do necessarily maybe with the forms, but actually, yes, to a point. Helsinki always has been trapped between Russia, culturally between Russia and Europe, so there's a lot of gold that for me highly Russian. And there is a lot of shiny thing, which is the Stephen Hall plasma thing and so on, and we just know. So there are other elements, and the other things we incorporate to rituals and so on. But yeah, no, it's not the speciality of the house. No, it's not.
I have one more.
Yeah, as many as you want.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, you were in one particular project. You were explaining that you had developed a species of elements that you were using, like as a structure element or something that you were continuously rotating and everything. But okay, that is about one project. But when you showed us a series of projects, apart from adding to the complexity, what were the set of rules that you were fixed? Like, maybe the design of staircase was something like this, or the articulation was always following this set of rules?
In the context of the lecture, I tend to think that the work and the project looks more homogeneous than they are. There is a lot of case by case on the project, and I think there is a lot of context of factors and take into consideration when you work in a house different than museum, certain aspects of it. So I have my own internal, they have their own internal series of rules that belong to certain things, and there are other factors that have to do with other elements. So there are projects within which structure was more important than other ones. There are some others that they have less problem. There were some projects that ornament became more important, some perforation. So it changed from project to project to an extent. But I strongly believe in the notion of rules and internal logic of it. I believe that notion, and in that sense, I'm very much with the notion of the tradition of people like Peter Eisman and so on and so forth, that they believe in architecture internal logic in the same way that art or music operates. And I'm aware that architecture is not the same thing, of course, but so it depends, and also one assumed that for example, when I explained in the house, we did these different cells, one belonged to the envelope, one belonged to the structure, and so on. Of course, the next project that we do after that, that remained the same. We still keep doing that, and we add other elements, and you work with other elements. But in other aspects, in a very strange way, and probably you're not going to believe me on this, I'm a very traditional architect. In this sense, I was educated in a way, in the Argentinian way, like all the projects I show you, all of them, they were a problem presented to us by somebody else. A competition, a client, a museum, a product design company. None of these projects are abstract speculation on our part. It's not that they say, oh, let's do a house and see what we can do. All of them, they're projects with a real problem. And we take those factors as a friction into consideration in each of the projects. I cannot work without a problem. I have no interest whatsoever in work in the extraction of the problem. That's why I don't consider myself an artist, even though the work have an artistic quality. Even the art commission that we have, they were commissioned to us. It's not like I was in my office doing a sculpture and then I'm going to see to who I can sell it. I can't. I truly can't. I cannot think in those terms. I need the conflict. So to your questions, that need dictates a lot of the things and how we tweak and how we work with the rules. But there is something about the rules and there's something about fashion design that interests me a lot. I love the notion of 4 collections a year that fashion designers, but now they're by 8, most of them they do 8. I love that. I love that we have collections, and I like that we have blocks of projects. You know, I like a lot. I like a lot that idea. I love that idea. So I like to set up rules, and each of the rules have a life of 5 or 6 projects, and then we move to new rules. Do I need to do that? No, but my brain needs it, and that's part of the challenge. So I'm okay with that, and some of them are incredibly arbitrary, which, by the way, there are all the architects like that. Just the problem, I'm aware that the complexity of the world and what we do is a particular one. I'm aware, I'm not an idiot. But I always said that a lot of these questions that I get about the things, like none of you asked me yet, but because you guys are a clever audience. But if we were in a less clever school, some already would have asked me where the forms come from, or how do you know when you're done, and stuff like that. And then usually I would give them a smart answer and say, hey, how do you know how you're done having sex? You just know. But the truth of the matter is, if I was in one of those schools and I would be presenting glass box after glass box after glass box, nobody would ask that question. Because we assume there is a misinformation, a misconception about certain parameters of architecture that are established that we accept. And everybody who don't operate within that, so my rules are arbitrary, so everybody else. So I'm trying to be very honest about what interests and motivates my work. Of course, when we talk with clients, we only tell half of the story, because if I tell Boeing that I'm interested in mutilating cows, it's very unlikely that they will give me the project. But the truth is, that's what I'm looking at home. I mean, I'm looking books on mutilating cows. And I think that's okay, and I think that's what every architect does in one way or another. Well, probably no mutilating cows, but looking at stuff. So I really believe that those things matters big time. So those are my rules, and who else rules are going to play by? I mean,
hello.
Yeah, there's one guy on the left. You. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Hi.
Okay, to what extent does materiality and structural constraint affect the design process of probably realizing something that's as imaginative and goes through like genetic order?
You were not listening when I was saying the materiality is not...
I heard it, but probably...
No, I understand. It plays a role, again, traditional architect in that sense. Some people ask you, oh, why you don't develop this? I mean, you develop the project based on the opportunity. When you do a competition, usually you don't need to go that far. So you have a general idea, yes, I know in the Helsinki that probably will be titanium, some kind of metal composite, but I don't know in detail. So in that sense, I'm very schooled. I mean, like, okay, when the project became real, then we look at the options. But in that sense, also I became very American as an architect, so I got very accustomed to work with consultants. So I work with a team of people who give you options, and so on. So I'm never so interested in the materiality per se. I was interested in the effect per se. So in that sense, I'm completely anti-European, in the sense of if we want to do a chrome shiny curvature wall, and the guy can do it out of plastic or metal, I don't give a fuck if it's plastic or metal. I just want the effect. As far, do you know what I mean? So I'm much more interested in the perception of the materiality than the materiality per se. Again, I'm not saying that you should be proud of that, but that's how my brain works. I think Peter Suntor or Harrison and de Meron are phenomenal. Well, Peter Suntor no, but Harrison and de Meron, yes, they're phenomenal and doing that, and I think they're great architecture based on that. So it plays as an image effect problem more than as a true problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There's somebody here on the left.
Last question.
I didn't say that it's not for people. I say that I hate people. Not the same thing.
So, what do you design? Is it
Look, like any creative activity, you work for an... Let me see if I can say this in a way that makes sense. I think architects, including myself, we need to get out of the business of people and get in the business of audience. We need to start to do architecture for an audience and not for people. When we do for people, I always think it's an alibi for excuse of certain things. So any architect who tell you do things for the people, of course you do for the people, you want somebody to use it. But what does it mean? Who is it people? Who is the individual and so on? So I think the world tried to be about their own terms, and I'm interested in people engaging with it, but I have zero interest in what is the... First of all, because you don't know what it is. This is something that is it's a fascinating problem. And this is something that recently in a discussion I was with a video game designer, and he killed me with this question. He truly killed me and hit me thinking for the last 2 months. He says, he was the kid of architects. He was 22, 23, one of the most important video game designers now in America. Brilliant kid. And he said to me, you know, architecture never interests me because you guys don't know who your user is. Video games, cars, designers, fashion designer, everybody knows they have a user. Architect, we have clients. It's not the same thing as a user. So whoever pays for the museum is your client, but you don't know the users and so on. So when I'm saying when I don't design for the people, it's not that the people I don't want the people to use it. It's just it's very difficult to try to anticipate what the people will react and so on. So the only thing you can anticipate is what you can control and how that relates to the people. But the reason I'm talking about audiences is because I think architecture needs to start to have a much more fluid relationship and how we educate the relation with the people. So when I say what I hate people, it's a thing because it's the relation with people, architecture is a complex one because most of the people in the discussion, they tend to be about a problem of taste. Like architecture is a problem of taste, you know? And the people think they're entitled to an opinion when it came to architecture, and I think that's wrong. I hate that when you have a project you have to convince a committee and whatever, and now neighborhood commission. I don't know you have that in Barcelona, but now in America, on top of the planning department, you need to get the neighbors to approve the building, which is a bunch of morons. So imagine that you have a brain tumor and you have to have a surgery and your doctor says, wow, hold on, let's have a committee with your neighbors to figure out what is the best course for surgery. So I know architecture is different than that. So I don't design for people, but of course the people is the audience. But in that sense, I feel much closer with true musicians or true artists. It's one thing, I mean, you can do music for the people, like, I don't know, Katy Perry, Britney Spears, or Justin Timberlake, any of those stupid, Lady Gaga, whatever, that is completely driven by people, whatever. Or you can be Tom Waits and do what you're interested in doing, interested to engage with the audience and interested to engage with the people. And of course, you're going to have a much smaller audience. I'm okay with that. I mean, that's why I'm saying I don't care about people. It's not I don't care. Of course I want. I'm here. I'm talking to you guys. I'm interested to discuss the idea. I'm interested in the clients. That's what I was saying. I'm not a self-immolated artist. I want to be successful. I want to work. I want to build. But I want to do it in my terms. I have no problem whatsoever walking out of a project. If Boeing tomorrow came to me and said, we don't want to do this, can you change it? I said, thank you very much, I'm walking away. I don't care. I truly don't care. So if I'm going to do it, I do it in my terms. It's not worth doing it. So in that sense, I don't care about people. But of course, I think architecture has contributed to do a better city, better people, a better society. It had to do all the things. But it had to be in the Miles Davis way. You know, Miles Davis was interested to do better music, and with that, he will influence the relation between blacks and white America. He never made one political statement in whole his career. But he believed that he would focus on his music, and his music have an impact. I like to think that I'm interested in doing that, but working for the people? Who the fuck knows what the people is? Really, who does? No. So most of the people do stuff for the developers. And the developers tell the people what the people want. And that's how it goes. But if you can figure out a way how to do work for the people, by all means, go for it. I don't. One more in the back? Yes.
Some of the projects you said you hated them, and I guess, do you see that maybe those projects didn't get a reaction from people, and that's why, or?
I hate it because I think they were bad. I mean, I like to show everything that I do, because I think when you're a student, you're learning, you have to understand that we all are very critical of what we do. Actually, I think it's a healthy thing that you hate most of the stuff that you do. If you don't, I think there's something wrong with you, or with me. I hate most of the work that I do. And that's okay, that's a good thing. But also, I don't know, I love architecture, but I don't live and die by what architecture does to me. You know, architecture, it is what it is. You do what you do, and you try your best, and sometimes your best is good enough, and sometimes it's not. So what? So, certain projects are worse than others, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not going to say that stupid thing that I will say, oh, they're like my children, I love all of them. No, I don't. I like some of them, and some of them I don't. I mean, no, the reaction that people look, I mean, first of all, you know, the whole notion of reaction on people, where is a whole stupidity about the notion of how you recognize all you are, how recognizable your work is. At the end of the day, probably our audience in the whole world is 20,000 people, if. Okay? So that in the whole world, the people who truly care about high-end architecture or whatever, right? So, how you know? I mean, I hate it because I hate it, it's okay. But you have to. You have to hate what you do, on principle. Also, it's healthy for your marriage and other things that you channel your hatred to what you do. It's a healthy thing. It's better than hating yourself. I hate what I do, I love myself, so it goes okay. Anything else?
Who do you want to promote more? Users, politics, decision makers?
I'm interested to do a work that you had to think a little bit, and you had to understand. That's what the problem of affect interests me. Who I want to provoke? Everybody who is in that factor. I mean, there are different stages. Certain people you can provoke, certain people you need on your side. But it's a matter of the value of the aesthetic project and how you can push and how the notion of progress. But it's much more interesting to work through that time. I mean, at least the stuff that interests me always was like that. I mean, the stuff we tend to forget, you know. But I think through provocation is how you produce much more fruitful work. And I think it's a simple problem, and this is what you do every day of your life for your life. So everybody, I mean, it's better to try to make it relevant. It's better to try to make it interesting. And I think provoking is a much more interesting way to be complacent. The world is fulfilled of very correct and decent and good architects. Why not? I mean, why not to provoke? And I think it's a need. I think it's a cultural need to do that. And
Who do you want to provoke?
Probably the clients who are willing to pay for it, and to understand the value of it, to understand the value of being outside that. I don't know, hopefully we can provoke better reaction on the young architects. I mean, look, you go up and down. I mean, your level of influence goes up and down, and everybody's like that, and sometimes you're high, sometimes you're low. Sometimes more students listen to you, and some of them don't. And so I have little interest that people copy what I do, and they do, and that's okay. There's no problem for me. But my only idea is to provoke the students to go against the norm, against the convention. The only value to be in architecture is to do something that matters. Because already, if you're interested in money, you're in the wrong profession from the get-go. So might as well do your life, make it interesting. Whatever interests you. Some people like to get along. I don't. I like to have enemies. I believe an architect needs enemies. Yeah, I never wrote the Martin Fierro. Yeah, but who do you want to provoke the most? Who the fuck knows? I don't know. I don't fight against everybody because I'm fairly successful. That means I have some friendships. It's important to choose your friends and your enemies wisely. And so it's okay. I mean, it's okay to fight a little bit. But also, look, bottom line is simple. Each of us, we are what we are. So if you have one message is, try to be who you are and don't be shy about bringing your own interest into your work. That's all I'm saying. To me, provocation work because it fuels me. It's what gives me energy. I like that. I'm not a competitive guy, for example, in that sense. I really don't give a fuck who wins or lose things and so on. I've never been an envious guy and so on. So that doesn't fuel me because I think architecture is a subjective discipline, but provoking, it fuels me. I like that. I enjoy that. But I don't know. I mean, I should talk that with a therapist. Because also in my personal life, I'm very mellow. I'm the most bourgeois guy. I don't drink alcohol. I never tried one drug in my life. Not even pot. Nothing. So I'm a very simple, in my personal life, I'm very mellow with simple taste and bourgeois taste. I have no interest whatsoever. I'm not a strange guy in my habits. So all the insanity is in the work, and that's very healthy for me, and that's maybe why, I don't know. And also probably because I didn't want to be an architect in the first time, so maybe I punish in architecture because I'm an architect. Who the fuck knows? I don't know. I like, Mark Wigley once says when he introduced me in Columbia, that he says architects were torture guys. And he says I was different because I torture architecture. So I like that. Anyway. You want to say something? You want to?
The only thing I am very interested in your seminar that you are doing together with because I don't want to there is a lot of things interesting to talk about the idea of activity, the architecture, the graph, no problem. We continue after. The only thing is that I am absolutely interested in your link, in your seminar, in the seminar that you will do together, because there is a situation with the idea of a scale.
Yeah.
You talk about the scale. The scale is not tamaño, is not escala. Como se dice in English, tamaño is size. Or no, algo así. Size is not the scale. You have an incredible transit in the scales in all your work. Congratulations, because it's amazing. It's absolutely interesting. From the complex environment to the objects. And now the question is possible to arrive to, with this logic, with this kind of nature, to go to the scale of the cities, the radical regions?
Yeah.
How to do? I am interested. It's not a question, perhaps. It's a curiosity.
I have no idea.
Exactly.
I didn't show it, but we did an attempt in a project for Maribor. But I always joke to Willie that one of the provocation is that for me it's difficult because I really don't have interest in the urban scale. Not because I don't think it's important, it's because I never have one single interesting thought to offer. Also because most of the cities that I like were not very much designed. So I like cities how they are, and if it were for me, we should leave it alone. But at the same time, I'm interested in the problem of that, and we're trying to figure that out. Maybe at the end of the semester, we can have a conversation about that, because really this is the first time I'm confronted to really think about the problem. Again, it's the same answer I give to her. I cannot think in a problem that nobody gives me. If somebody says, will you do master plans? Of course. And then I'll think about it and I'll show you what we did. But I have no idea, I have no one idea whatsoever for the cities. Except that they all should have red light neighborhood, which I think is a healthy thing. That's my own idea for cities.